All right, fantastic. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about the 5 key qualities of a successful brand. The 5 key qualities of a successful brand. So branding is kind of like an art and a science. And, I've done lots of research to try to uncover like what is it about these brands that make them tick. So a lot of these successful brands, what are some of the key qualities that they tend to have in common? So obviously, there's so many different qualities that could contribute to the success of a business. So for example, there might be internal factors, there might be societal factors, there might be monetary factors, there might be economical factors. So there's so many different factors that could contribute to the success of a brand. But in this presentation, I'll just be honing in on 5 key qualities of a successful brand. So by applying these qualities to our businesses, we could also achieve greater results in our marketing and sales offerings as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is the 5 key qualities of a successful brand. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first key quality of a successful brand is that it needs to have that emotional connection. It needs to have that emotional connection because no matter what industry that you're in, there's always that opportunity to create a more emotional connection with your audience. So some industries are actually more emotional than others, and some industries are actually more rational than others. But generally speaking, there's always that opportunity to create that more emotional connection. And when you're able to achieve that, you're able to create much more preference for what you have to offer. You're able to create much more preference for your brand and your message as well. Okay, so first we need to understand, why is emotion so important when building a strong brand? Why is emotion so important? Well, the first reason why emotion is so important is that our purchasing decisions are actually influenced by how we feel. So a lot of times our purchasing decisions are influenced by how we feel. So a lot of studies have been done, and these studies have proven that the way people buy is they tend to buy based on the subconscious. So we tend to have all these subconscious associations with certain brands. And then these associations are influenced by how we feel. And then how we feel is what tends to influence our rational decision making. So some people are definitely more rational than others, but generally speaking, we're much more emotional than we may think when it comes to our purchasing decisions. And secondly, like emotional decisions are actually much easier to make. So think about your own personal life. So you might have come across a time when you had to make a really difficult decision and you didn't have all the facts, you didn't have much time, you didn't have much information. So you just made that decision based on how you felt at that time. So that's the same with your customers is most of the time they're making these decisions based on how they feel because it's just much easier even in politics, for example. So when people vote for a politician, they're not really looking at all the details in each person's policy and analyzing everything. So they're just making that decision based on how that politician makes them feel. So, for example, who seems more trustworthy to them? Who do they feel is more competent? So most of the time, they just look at that person's character and just make decisions based on how they feel about that person. And that's the same with brands. The second reason why emotion is so important is that customers or just people in general, they always remember how you made them feel. So it's not just about how do we market, it's more about how can we increase the impact that our brand is making in the lives of others. Because customers, they always remember how you made them feel. So if you're trying to build a brand that's much more memorable and impactful, then it's really important to pay more attention to how your brand makes them feel and how can we amplify the impact in their lives. So that's why emotion is so important. All right, so now that we've talked about why emotion is so important, let's take a look at some crucial emotional drivers that a lot of people tend to have. So when we look at our customers, what are some of their emotional drivers? What's really driving them to make a lot of these purchasing decisions? So one example of an emotional driver could be perhaps the desire for a higher status. the desire for a higher status. So this is really popular in the luxury industry. So for example, when people are buying these houses and these cars, they're not just buying it because of the product itself. They're buying it because of how it makes them feel, and they want to feel like they're being elevated to a higher status. So one example of a brand that taps into this would be maybe Rolex. So Rolex is a brand that sells watches. Another example is Cartier that also sells watches. So when people buy these watches, they're not just buying it because they want to tell the time. They're buying it because of how it makes them feel and how they would be perceived by others. So maybe they would be seen as more business savvy or more affluential or more successful. And that's what really drives them. So another example of an emotional driver could be the desire for a sense of belonging. So maybe your customers, they just need a stronger sense of belonging. So this really runs deep into our subconscious because we all want to feel like we're part of a tribe. We all want to be around people who have a similar lifestyle as we do, who have similar beliefs as we do. So that's why that sense of belonging is really powerful. So one example of a brand that taps into that sense of belonging is Gymshark. So Gymshark is a brand that sells apparel for people who go to the gym, so fitness apparel. So what Gymshark was able to do was create a community around weightlifting, around bodybuilding. So when people wear Gymshark, it's kind of like they're part of a community, a part of a tribe of people who love to go to the gym and who live a very vigorous lifestyle. And this can be seen in a lot of their campaigns because they're always trying to create that sense of community around going to the gym. Another example of an emotional driver is the desire to mitigate fears and risk. So this is a really powerful emotional driver because we all want to mitigate fears and risk. So one example of a brand that taps into this is Allstate. So Allstate Insurance, they recently did a campaign called Mayhem, in which they have this character called Mayhem who shows up in these very dangerous scenarios. So maybe there was an explosion, maybe there was an accident. So by exposing people to these dangerous scenarios, that would really push their customers to rethink their insurance policy and the kinds of coverage that they have. So when it comes to industries like insurance, then that desire to mitigate fears is a huge emotional driver that the customers tend to have. Another example of an emotional driver could be the desire for more creativity. So maybe your customers, they just need more creativity. They just need a chance to speak their mind, to express themselves. And that could be a really powerful thing. So one example of a brand that taps into this desire for creativity is Michaels. So Michaels is a brand that sells art supplies. So everything from their products to their taglines, it's all about really stimulating that creativity so that people feel inspired to create more art. Another example is Adobe. That's a software company that's focused on providing software, different design software programs. So these brands, through their products and through their messaging, it's all about speaking to that desire for more creativity. Another example of an emotional driver could be the desire to feel empowered. So maybe your customers, they just want to feel empowered. They just want to feel inspired. And that could also be a really powerful driver. So one example of a brand that taps into this need is Cemex. So to those who don't know what Cemex is a brand that sells cement. And cement is one of the most boring industries. There's nothing emotional about cement, but still they were able to create that emotional connection. So when people buy from Cemex, they're not just buying cement, they're buying a dream, they're buying hope, they're buying into the story that revolves around inspiration and feeling empowered. So that's why Cemex has been really successful, was because they were able to create that emotional connection around cement. So by looking at Cemex, we can see that no matter what industry that you're in, you can definitely create that emotional connection with people, even if you sell water. Another example is Microsoft. So Microsoft, for example, their mission statement is to empower people to achieve more. And this could be seen through their messaging, through their campaign, through their product. Everything ties into what they're all about. So when you look at all these different emotional drivers, which of these emotional drivers do you feel like your customers might be having? So there are so many other emotional drivers. But in this presentation, I'm just walking you through about 5 of them. But there's so many different emotional drivers that your brand can tap into. And when you're able to accomplish that, that would really allow you to connect with your customers at a much deeper level. Okay, so now that we've looked at the emotional drivers, how can we really create that emotional connection with our customers? How can we really create that desire? So the first question is, what are some of your customers' emotional drivers? A lot of times they might not even tell you, but these emotional drivers tend to lie beneath the surface. So what are some of your customers' emotional drivers? They might even have certain emotional drivers that other people aren't really speaking to. And that could give your brand a huge advantage if you're able to identify emotional drivers that other people aren't speaking to. So once we take a look at our customers, we can now determine like which emotional drivers can our brand tap into through our messaging, through our products, through the overall experience. What emotional drivers can we tap into? And then once we figure out what that is, the next step is how can we really amplify the emotional impact and create a much deeper connection with people? So for example, how do you want people to feel when they use our products, when they read our copy, when they watch our videos, when they look at our advertisements? How can we really amplify the emotional impact and really connect with people at a much deeper level? So when you're able to really accomplish that, that would really allow you to really elevate your brand to new heights and really connect with people at a higher level. So that's what that emotional connection is all about. So the second key quality of a successful brand is that they always have that perceived differentiation. So they're always perceived as different from all the others. Even though they're selling the same thing, they're always perceived as very different from all the others. So differentiation is a really powerful thing. And also, it's not just about differentiation, it's also about being different in a way that people value, in a way that people care about. So, for example, if your brand had lots of polka dots, it might draw some attention, but it's not really going to create preference for your offers because it's different, but it's not different in a way that's really valuable. So it's really important to be different, but in a way that people actually value, to really bring something unique to the table that has lots of value that people can appreciate. Okay, so why is differentiation so important? So in today's world, there's so much competition. There's more competition than ever in history. With the dot-com bubble, with globalization, with the rise of social media, there's so much competition. And your customers, you're constantly being bombarded with all kinds of different advertisements from so many different brands. So nowadays, it's so important for your brand to really stand out from all the others. The second reason why differentiation is so important is that your customers, you're constantly being distracted. You're constantly being distracted from all kinds of different advertisements. And so, for example, they have their personal life, they have work, they have their careers. So they have a lot going on. So it's all about thinking of how can we really stand out more? How can our message really stand out and really grab their attention? The third reason why differentiation is so important is that it's much easier to be different than to be better. So I'm not saying that being better doesn't matter. You should still try to make your offers as good as you can, but it's much easier to be different because if your brand is very different, then all your customers can agree that your brand is different. But if your brand is better, only a fraction of people would agree that your brand is better. So better is just based on opinions. It's subjective. So being different is much easier. And also, by being different, you can compete with companies that are 10 times larger than your size. So you can compete with companies that have bigger budgets, more resources. So for example, if I was to compete with Amazon, I can't possibly be better than Amazon because I don't have the resources, I don't have the budget. But if I'm different and find an area where my brand can be very, very unique, then that would really allow me to compete at a much higher level because I'm in my own lane. So that's why it's much easier to be different. Okay, so now that we understand why differentiation is so important, the next step is how can our brands really stand out from the crowd? How can our brands really stand out from the crowd? So my question to you is, do you have a unique selling proposition? So a unique selling proposition, it's also called the unique value proposition. And just like the name suggests, it's all about the unique value that you're proposing. So what's the unique offer? What's the unique value that your brand is bringing to the table? So that's one really powerful way to really differentiate your brand by offering a unique selling proposition. A second way to differentiate your brand is by having a unique approach or perspective. So, for example, maybe you have a unique perspective on your industry or how things should be done. Maybe you have a different perspective on the world as a whole. So, when you have that unique perspective, that would really allow you to develop different offers, and allow your brand's messages to be much different because everything is aligned with your unique perspective, your core values, and the guiding principles that shape a lot of the decision making inside your enterprise. So by having a unique perspective, that could be a really powerful thing. By having a unique way of doing things. Another way to differentiate your brand is by solving a unique need. So when you look at your different customer groups, maybe there's a unique need or a unique problem that they have that other people aren't really catering to. Maybe there are certain target groups that other people aren't really serving. So by solving a unique need, that could be another really powerful way to differentiate your brand by uncovering a unique problem that your brand can solve. Another way for your brand to really stand out from the crowd is by creating a unique experience. By creating a unique experience. So we'll talk about brand experience in more detail down the road. But when you look at all the different ways that customers interact with your brand, it's all about how can we make it much more unique, much more different from everything else that's out there. So by looking at these four key areas, you can now start to develop an effective strategy to really differentiate your brand from all the others. And it all starts by gaining a much deeper understanding of your target audience, along with your industry as well. Okay, so the third key quality of a successful brand is coherence. Coherence. It has to be coherence. So there's so many different ways that customers interact with your brand. So for example, you may have a website, you may have a landing page, you may have your own events, you may have your own videos, you may even have your own podcast. So the best way to understand coherence and what it means is by thinking about your brand as kind of like a mosaic. So your brand is kind of like a mosaic or a puzzle. So you have all these different parts that fit together and really shape your brand as a whole. So it's all about looking at all these different fragments and thinking about how can they all work together to really shape my brand as a whole and help me to achieve my goals. So a coherent brand has all these different parts that's really working together to really shape the overall experience, to shape the brand as a whole. Another way to look at coherence is, for example, to think about your brand as an ecosystem. So for example, different customers are kind of like different types of animals. So for example, I'm a completely different type of animal than you are. So customers, they're all like different types of animals. They all have different lifestyles. So by gaining a deeper understanding of your audience, you can now develop an experience that's designed to attract people of a certain lifestyle, or to attract people of a certain status. So there are different types of customers. So by understanding the different types of customers that there are, you can now develop an experience to attract these target groups. So it's all about having these different pieces that work together to really help you attract your target audience. So all these pieces are working together. You could also say it's kind of like a machine. So you have all these different parts that's working together. So for example, maybe they find you on social media and then they visit your website and then they watch your videos. So all these things form an experience that leads to that eventual purchasing decision. So that's what coherence is all about. It's just looking at your brand from a holistic point of view. So not just the logo, but how everything fits together as a whole. Okay, so why is coherence so important? So coherence brings familiarity which builds trust, which drives sales. So if you have a brand that's very coherent, then everything just works together very nicely. Everything seems very familiar. So for example, if you walked into Target, you can definitely tell that you're in Target. Even if you didn't see the logo, you can just tell where you are because of the experience. Or if you walked into a Starbucks, you could just tell where you are, even though you didn't see the logo. So all these brands are carefully crafted to be very coherent. So everything from the website to the overall experience, everything works together to really shape the perception that you're trying to create. Because if your brand is very familiar, then people would have that, they would have a stronger sense of trust because they're familiar, they're comfortable with it, they recognize it, so therefore they trust it. And if they trust your brand, they're much more likely to buy from you. And that's why coherence is so important. And another thing is that a brand without coherence will be confusing. So if your brand is not coherent, then it means that your brand is all over the place. You have all these different parts, but they're not really working together. So you end up having a brand that's really confusing, and customers, they don't really understand what it's all about. Another reason why coherence is so important is that coherence is much better than consistency. So I'm not saying that consistency doesn't matter, but the thing about consistency is that it can often be a trap. So if your brand is too consistent, then that could prevent you from coming up with new ideas. So not everything has to be consistent, but everything has to be coherent. So you can still come up with new ideas, but everything needs to fit together and really tie in with your brand and what your brand is all about. Everything needs to fit together, and based on the perception it's trying to create, the experience they're trying to create, and based on the goals you're trying to achieve. So everything has to work together. So that's what coherence is all about. Okay, so now that we understand why coherence is so important, so what actually makes a brand coherent? What is it about a brand that makes it coherent? So one thing that makes a brand coherent is that it has a coherent strategy. So there has to be like a central theme that runs through everything. So your brand strategy is kind of like the DNA behind it. It has to be so once you have a coherent strategy, it would serve as the backbone, the framework. So when you have a coherent strategy, that would help to determine the kinds of products to release. It would help to determine the kinds of people to partner with, the kinds of people that you need to hire, because all these people would need to align with your brand and what your brand is all about. So it would help to determine the overall experience that people have, because everything will need to tie in with your brand and what it's all about. Another thing that makes a brand coherent is that it has a coherent messaging. So when you look at your brand's messaging, everything has to be coherent, everything has to fit together and really tell the story of what your brand is all about. There has to be that distinct voice that allows customers to recognize and really resonate with your message. Another thing that makes a brand coherent is that it has a coherent experience. So branding, it used to be about the look and the feel, but nowadays it's all about the experience. It's more about the experience because there's so many different ways that customers interact with your brand. So nowadays, brands are even looking at audio, like which audio elements will make it easier for people to recognize our brand. Which kinds of songs should come to mind, which kinds of sounds, even the visuals. So when we talk about the visuals, I'm not just talking about the logo, I'm talking about how your brand looks as a whole. So there has to be a variety of visual elements that make it much easier for people to recognize and remember your brand. So all these things will really help to strengthen your brand's image and make it much more memorable. And also, which other ideas can make the brand's experience more coherent? So a brand is kind of like a collection of different ideas. So all these ideas need to come together to really shape the brand. So for example, it could be an idea for a new release. It could be an idea for a new collaboration. So all these things need to work together and really tie in with what your brand is all about and help to strengthen it. So that's what really makes a brand coherent. Okay. All right. So the next key quality of a successful brand is that it has to be authentic. It has to be authentic because the world needs more authenticity. So there's so many brands that are out there. There are probably millions. But when it comes to brands that are actually authentic, very few of them are actually authentic brands. So the world needs more authentic brands. So why is authenticity so important? So your customers, they can actually sense if your brand is fake, and this affects the level of trust that they have. So if your brand isn't perceived as authentic, then they would be able to sense that it's fake. So they would perceive your brand as just like everyone else. And this affects how they, the level of trust that they have and how they respond to it if they perceive it as just like everyone else. Another thing about authentic brands is that they're very hard to replace. They're very hard to replace. So if you have a brand that's perceived as authentic, then customers, they're much more likely to listen to you and they're much more likely to choose your offer, even though there might be other options that's out there. Even though they might be cheaper, they're much more likely to choose you because your brand is much more authentic. Another thing about authentic brands is that an authentic brand would also attract authentic people. So if you have an authentic brand, then it would also attract authentic customers as well. It would also attract authentic partners that align with that vision. It would also attract authentic employees, right? And an authentic team. So an authentic brand will also attract authentic people that would really help to strengthen the brand and make it much more impactful. Okay, so what makes a brand authentic? What actually makes a brand authentic then? Well, one thing that makes a brand authentic is that an authentic brand stays true to the purpose and the vision that it was founded on. So when it comes to an authentic brand, it's not just about pushing products and services. There's actually like a bigger vision behind it. There's a bigger impact that you're trying to make in the world or in your industry. So an authentic brand really stays true to that purpose and that vision. Another thing about authentic brands is that they always have a deeper meaning behind them. So when people buy from Starbucks, when they buy from Apple, when they buy from Nike, when they buy from IKEA, there's always a deeper meaning behind what they're buying. So these companies, they don't just sell products and services, they sell the meaning behind it. There's always that deeper meaning behind it. There's always that story behind it that customers are buying into. Another thing that makes a brand authentic is that an authentic brand will go beyond the transaction. So if you're trying to build an authentic brand, then it's not just about making a sale. It's more about that relationship that you're building with your customer. So it's more of a longer term relationship of value. So it's not just about the transaction, it's more about the longer term relationship in which you're gaining a better understanding of your customers. And then you're using these insights to come up with much better offers, much better messaging for your marketing. Another thing about authentic brands is that an authentic brand is committed to quality. So if you look at authentic brands, they always have that commitment to quality. And this has to be shown through their product releases and also through their design. So when it comes to these successful products, for example, a lot of thought goes into their design to really make sure that it's at a top quality. So they always try to make their offers as good as they can because design is kind of like a silent ambassador for your brand. So there always has to be that commitment to quality and all the work that you do, it has to really reflect your brand's integrity and the brand's vision. It needs to really put your brand at a higher standard. Okay, so the fifth key element of a successful brand is crystal clarity. Crystal clarity. So we spoke about crystal clarity in the previous presentation, but let's just go over crystal clarity again and why it's so important. So our customers, they live in a really complex world and they have very complex lives. So for example, they have family, they have work, they have their careers. So if your brand is not clear and if your brand is too complex, then you're gonna chase people away because you're adding to that complexity. And also, our brains naturally prefer things that are much clearer and easier to understand. So if your brand and your message is much clearer and easier to understand, then you're naturally going to attract more people to your brand and to your message. Another thing about clarity is that if your brand is not clear, then what happens is your customers end up having these false conclusions because you're not clear up front about what you're all about. So a lot of times our customers, they may have these false conclusions based on their past experiences, based on what someone else said, based on what they saw on the television. So all these things also shape how they perceive your brand as well. So that's why it's so important to be really clear up front about what you're all about. So my question to you is, do you have a crystal clear brand? Do you have a crystal clear brand? So what makes a brand crystal clear? So one thing that makes a brand crystal clear is that they have the clear vision. So there has to be that clear vision. So like, what's the overall vision behind the brand? Where you're looking to take it? And what's the big impact you're trying to make in your industry or in the world or in the lives of your customers? What's the big vision behind it? Another thing that makes a brand crystal clear is that it has a clear focus. So this is also called the positioning. So one thing about successful brands is that they always have that clear focus. So you're not all over the place. So having a clear focus is all about finding out what are my brand strengths or what are some key areas that I can focus on that my customers would value the most, or what do I have a huge advantage? So for example, if Apple decided to release an iChicken, do you think people would buy it? They probably wouldn't, right? Because we know Apple is a tech company. So if they started to expand into chicken, then it probably wouldn't be very successful. And this has happened several times in history because, when it comes to building brands, if you have that clear focus, that would really help to strengthen your brand. And if you end up diverging into other areas that's not related, then that would also weaken your brand as well. So the clearer your focus is, the stronger your brand is. Even brands like Walmart, that they sell so many different things, they still focus on low prices. So if Walmart decided to sell luxury goods, for example, or luxury cars, it probably wouldn't be very successful, right? Because we know Walmart for low prices. That's what they're known for. So they have a clear focus. So that's what having a clear focus is all about. It's just about finding out what your brand does best and just focusing on that. And over time, your brand will become much stronger. Another thing that makes a clear brand is that it has a clear objective. So, for example, what do you see your brand by this time next year? Or what do you see your brand in the next 5 to 10 years? So, when you have these clear objectives, we can now make more informed decisions that align with our objectives. And when you have clear objectives, that would also help to put your team on the same page as well, so that everyone works together cohesively. Another thing about crystal clear brands is that they have a clear target audience. So having a clear target audience is not about discriminating against everyone else. It's not about targeting just one person or like a very small group of people. So having a clear target audience is more about just gaining a much deeper understanding of the kinds of people who buy what you're offering, or the kinds of people who would be most interested in what you have to offer. So for example, what are some of their critical challenges? What are some of their key pain points? What are some of their aspirations? So by understanding your audience and by having a much clearer picture of who they are, you can now develop messaging that's much more effective to speak to these people. And that leads us to our next point, which is having a clear message. So when it comes to having a clear message, it's kind of like feeding a child. So when you're feeding a child, you don't want to stuff too much food in the baby's mouth. So it's really important to really crumble it up so that it's as simple as possible so that your customers can easily digest. Because like I said earlier, they have very complex lives and our brains are trying to process a lot of information. So if your brand's message is also very complex, then you're gonna end up chasing people away from your message, right? Because they're adding to that complexity. So it's really important to have a message that's as clear as possible and as simple as possible as well. And also, one thing about crystal clear brands is that they need to have a clear perception. So your brand's perception is everything. So it's influenced by the design and also your messaging. So all these things shape the perception that customers have. So a lot of times, how you want to be perceived might be different from how your customers perceive you. So sometimes it might even be a good idea to find out, like, how is my brand currently perceived by customers? So by having a clear perception and a clear message to a clear audience, and by setting clear objectives with a clear focus and a clear overall vision, you can now develop a brand that's much more impactful. Okay, so there we have it. So we've gone over the 5 key qualities of a successful brand. So the first is that emotional connection. So no matter what industry that you're in, there's always that opportunity to connect with people at a much deeper level. The second key quality we spoke about was differentiation, because there's so much competition nowadays. So what customers need is they need something new. So there has to be something new, something fresh that we can bring to the table. The second key quality is the third key quality is coherence. So like I said earlier, your brand is kind of like a mosaic or a puzzle. So you have all these pieces, and all these pieces need to work together to really shape your brand as a whole and the perception that you're trying to create, the experience that you're trying to create. The next key quality is authenticity, because there's so many different brands that are out there, but very few of them are actually authentic brands. The fifth key quality is crystal clarity, because clarity is key. So by having a crystal clear brand, that would really allow you to cut through a noisy industry and really connect with your customers at a much higher level. So those are the 5 key qualities: the emotional connection, differentiation, coherence, authenticity, and crystal clarity. Okay, so I hope you really found this interesting. We're going to dive right into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put your hands up in the chat. And if you get called upon, just let us know what your question is. Okay. Okay, so does anyone have any question? All right, so let me see. I see Lily Richardson.
Yes, and my apologies for being late. I thought this class started at 3, but very good presentation from what I heard. I have a lot of things that I do, and I'm trying to compound it into, that one brand that speaks to, the 5 qualities that you mentioned. What is your take on I'm not sure how to ask it, but it's in reference to AI. Is AI something that you would recommend or that I can use to try to put all of those things that I do that would push out like a type of brand that I can use?
Okay, so when it comes to AI, so AI is just simply a tool. So it's reliant on the person that's using it. So, for example, somebody might use AI to come up with ideas for messaging, but you would need to still determine if what it's telling you is accurate. Because I've personally tried AI, and there were times when the things that I was sent weren't very effective or very accurate. So there still needs to be that expertise to determine if what is being provided is even accurate or correct, or else it could also lead to a lot of issues down the road. So you could use AI, but I wouldn't recommend being too reliant on it. It's just something to complement what you already know. So if you use too much AI, then you end up having a brand that's very robotic. And when it comes to connecting with people, people connect with people. So if you're using AI, then it would be hard to connect with people, especially at an emotional level. Um,
Is there any particular tool that you would recommend then?
Well, so the tool all depends on like what you're trying to accomplish with that tool. So for example, are you looking for a tool that's good for, coming up with messages, or are you looking for a tool that's
For design, to
design?
design the brand?
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, so when it comes to design, it might be better to just to have a person, because a person would be able to really empathize with people and now develop, the right solution to really speak to those people. So I don't really know of any AI tool at the moment, that could really come up with, designs that really connect with people. But it
Okay.
can definitely be a good way to come up with, help you come up with ideas, or like, platforms like Canva can also help you. But thing about Canva is it uses lots of templates, so the design would end up looking like other people. But like I said, it's still a good way to just get your creative juices flowing. Um,
Okay, thank you.
sure. Okay, so who would like to go next? Does anyone have any questions or comments? All right, so I see Terrell Lipsy. Okay.
Mute. Okay, there you go. Yeah. So I think another part to her question is it's the same question I have. When you do have multi services, how to how can you even like with even with the elevator pitch? How can you just phrase that and cover what you do across the board, basically?
Okay. Yeah, so it depends on what those services are. It takes a lot of work to figure this out. But off the top of my head, one way that you could approach it is by just focusing on the service that's in most demand, right? That customers tend to that customers are most interested in, like the service that's most valuable, things like that, and then hone it down to the most valuable service. Because from my experience, the people who have multiple services, only a few of those services tend to attract the most customers. So you might consider like focusing on the service that's the most value, or also the service that you do your best work in,
Okay.
and then you can now have the other services on the side as well. Um, you know what I mean?
Great, great. Yeah, that's a good answer. Okay.
Yeah,
All right, thanks.
sure. Okay, so who would like to go next? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so we have Chris Turner.
Hey Eddie, first of all, thanks a lot, man. This was very helpful. You made a great presentation and you did a great job of just outlining the basic components in ways that, as you say, need to be simple and clear. I wanted to touch on something that you had under point four, authenticity,
Okay.
and it's so I was wondering about what makes a brand authentic, and you said an authentic brand has a deeper meaning behind it. Um, so I was wondering, I'm a freelance writer. I put a lot of thought in my branding and my messaging on my website, but it would help if you gave a really good example of a brand that has a deeper meaning behind it that I might have missed. So can you think of one?
Yeah, most of them do, if not all of them. That's really simple.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, give me an example of a brand. So let's say Coca-Cola, for example. So when people buy from Coca-Cola, they're not just selling a drink, right? They're selling happiness in a bottle. So they want you to perceive their drink as something that you can drink when you're out with your friends. So people associate their drink with happiness, with enjoyments, with parties. So something that you could share with your friends while you're outside having fun. So it's not just about the drink, it's about the experience that they create around it and that happiness in the bottle. So that's what really allows them to really make their campaigns much more impactful, is that they're not just saying, hey, we sell drinks. They're actually trying to sell happiness in the bottle. They want people to associate their drink with happiness and something that you could really share with a friend, something that fosters meaningful connections with people. They even had to share a Coke campaign in which you can have a Coke bottle with a person's name on it. So it's all about that connection, right? And that happiness and that really sharing that Coke with your friends. You know what I mean? Mhm. Let me give another example. What's another good example? What's another good example? So for example, we spoke about Cemex, the brand that sells cement, for example. So when people buy from Cemex, they're not just buying cement. So Cemex, they create a more emotional connection with people. So if you look at their campaigns, they're not just saying, hey, we got some cement by now, right? They're trying to sell people a dream of a better home, a better future, a brighter future. They're trying to inspire people. They're talking about hope. So that really helps to make their campaign much more impactful because there is much more meaning behind it. They even try to like do events that align with the local culture of the Latino population. So all these things really help to make their brand, like really elevate their brand to a new level. So it's not just about cement anymore. It's about culture. It's about hope. It's about a brighter future, things like that. So all these things help to give the brand much more meaning so that it's much different from everyone else who's selling cement. So these are all examples. What are some other examples? What else is there? What else? So yeah, all those brands that I mentioned in the emotional aspects, emotional connections, those are all examples of brands that have a deeper meaning. So when people buy these luxury brands, for example, they're not just buying the watch, right, to tell the time. You're buying it based on what it means to them and how it fits in with their status, things like that. Yeah. Even when people vote for a politician, right? So let's say they vote for Obama, for example, they're not looking at all the details in his policy, right? Most of the time, they're just voting for him based on what he means to them, what he's all about, because to them he represents change, things like that. So if you look at successful brands, they're not just selling a product or a service, they're selling meaning. There's always a deeper meaning that people are buying into. Do you understand or? Hello, is he there? Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. I muted myself because I didn't want to interrupt your flow. Yeah, I get it. That makes sense. Particularly that last one. As soon as you said Barack Obama, I immediately thought of hope and change.
Yeah.
And so, in a nutshell, that basically created something that his opponent did not
Mhm.
sell, and of course, you know, President Obama wound up winning. So that is a good point. So thank you.
Sure, definitely. So yeah, there's so many different examples. Like if you look at a lot of these successful brands, there's always a deeper meaning behind it. Let me see. That people are buying into. Okay, so who would like to go next? Does anyone else have any questions? And also, I need to point out that it's not just about the meaning, it's about how the meaning is being expressed. So it has to be expressed in a way that's really authentic, that would really speak to people so that they can really, connect with that brand. So, okay, so who would like to go next? Does anyone have any other questions or? All right. No one has any questions? Then that means I did a good job then. Let me see. Yeah. Who would like anyone else? All right. So, what if I was to ask you all a question? So, for example, does any of you have a vision statement, for example, that you would like to share? What's your vision? What's your big vision? Does anyone have anything? Just put your hands up in the chat or raise your hand up and I could, yeah. Okay, I see Lily Richardson. So, what's your vision statement? What's your big vision?
To empower people spiritually, mentally, physically, and economically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's really inspirational. So when you have a strong vision that's being expressed through your messaging, through your different offers, through your collaborations, through your programs, so all these things will really help to elevate your brand so that it's much more authentic and you're able to really connect with people at a much emotional level. Okay. Great, fantastic. So does anyone have any other questions that you would like to share? All right. So yeah, if no one else has any other questions, then it was really nice to have you all. I'm really grateful to you all for coming, and I hope you would be there for my next presentation as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. Mhm.